The gift, if one could call it that, was bestowed upon Prudence Bellamy on the occasion of her 25th birthday. It was not wrapped in silver paper or tied with a silk ribbon. It was announced over a lukewarm toast of thin sherry in the gray dining room of Bramblehurst Park, a house that had long ceased to feel like a home. Her aunt, Honora Bellamy, raised her glass, the crystal catching the meager candlelight and revealing the faint film of dust Prudence had not had time to polish away that morning. "To my niece, Prudence," Honora declared, her voice carrying the false, honeyed tone of public benevolence. "Upon reaching the age of 25, and with her prospects being what they are, I have decided to settle upon her a piece of property to call her own, a mark of her independence." Her cousin, Louisa, seated opposite, shifted uncomfortably, her gaze fixed on the wilting centerpiece of last week's flowers. The property was the old Severn Bridge, or rather, the ruin of it. It had collapsed in the spring storms, a catastrophe of splintered timber and fractured stone that had sent 2 carts and their drivers into the churning gorge below. The collapse had severed the primary trade route to the town of Marley, slowly strangling its commerce. The bridge was not an asset. It was a liability, a dangerous, worthless wreck attached to a public tragedy. It was a joke steeped in cruelty, a public declaration that Prudence, like the bridge, was broken and of no further use. "It is yours, my dear," Honora finished, a tight, satisfied smile playing on her lips, "to manage as you see fit." Prudence felt the familiar, cold weight settle in her stomach. She did not look at her aunt. She did not look at Louisa. She looked at her own hands, resting in her lap. They were steady. They were always steady. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. They were a currency her aunt did not value and could not spend. "Thank you, Aunt Honora," she said, her voice a quiet, level thing. "You are most generous." The lie tasted of ash, but it was a necessary armor. For 10 years since the death of her father, an engineer of modest success but brilliant mind, Prudence had been the unpaid, invisible engine of Bramblehurst Park. She was her aunt's ward, a title that was a euphemism for domestic servant. While her cousin Louisa practiced the pianoforte and embroidered samplers, Prudence managed the household accounts, her neat, precise script filling ledger after ledger. She stretched the dwindling Bellamy income, negotiated with merchants in Marley, oversaw the small staff, and mended the fraying household linens late into the night by the light of a single candle. Her life was a series of quiet, thankless tasks, her presence in the house as taken for granted as the rising of the sun. She was a fixture, silent and useful, and therefore entirely overlooked. In the privacy of her small, cold attic room, her only true inheritance was hidden away in a worn leather roll. It was her father's collection of drafting tools, compasses, calipers, and a heavy brass parallel ruler, its edges worn smooth with use. He had taught her to read the language of structure, to understand the forces of tension and compression, to see the world not as a series of objects, but as a system of balanced loads. "Integrity, Prudence," he used to say, his finger tapping a blueprint. "It is as true for a bridge as it is for a person. Without it, everything eventually collapses." Now, her aunt had given her a collapse, a monument to failure. The irony was so bitter, it almost choked her. That night, long after the strained silence of the evening had given way to the silence of sleep, Prudence sat at her small desk. She did not cry. She took out the brass ruler, its weight cool and solid in her hand. She thought of her father's lessons. She thought of the 10 years she had endured, the small humiliations, the endless work, the slow erosion of her own hopes, and she thought of the ruined bridge, a wound in the landscape, a problem. And her father had taught her that every problem, if studied correctly, contained the blueprint of its own solution. She did not know what that solution was, but as she held the cold, hard brass, a flicker of something that was not quite hope, but rather a stubborn resolve took root in her heart. She would not be a ruin. She would not collapse. The next morning, she rose before dawn, dressed in her plainest gray wool dress, and walked the 3 miles to the Severn Gorge. The air at the gorge was damp and smelled of wet stone and bruised greenery. A persistent mist clung to the sheer rock walls, muffling the sound of the river churning far below. The sight of the bridge was worse than the descriptions. It was a jagged wound in the earth. The great central stone arch had given way, a section of the roadway slumping into the void. Timbers, thick as a man's waist, were splintered like kindling, tangled with the wreckage of the carts that had been lost. It was a scene of violent failure. For an hour, Prudence walked the remaining abutments, her steps careful on the treacherous, rubble-strewn ground. She ignored the warning signs posted by the county council. This was her property now, her problem. Her mind, trained by her father, began to work. She was not seeing a tragedy. She was performing an analysis. The failure had not been random. She traced the fracture lines in the remaining stonework, her fingers brushing over the rough, broken surfaces. The southern abutment was solid, deeply keyed into the bedrock. The northern one, however, showed signs of slippage. The mortar was crumbling, a poor mix of sand and lime. But the true catastrophe had begun at the apex. She could see it even from this distance. The keystone. It was supposed to be the most perfect, most precisely cut stone in the entire arch, locking all the others, the voussoirs, into a state of perfect compression. But from the shape of the break, she could tell it had been improperly dressed. A slight, almost imperceptible flaw in its angle would have directed the immense forces of the arch outward instead of down. It would have pushed relentlessly, season after season, until the weaker northern foundation finally gave way. A shear fracture, she murmured to herself, the technical term falling from her lips as naturally as a prayer. Caused by a poorly set keystone. An astute observation. The voice was deep, quiet, and so unexpected it made her start. She spun around. A man stood not 20 feet away, half shrouded in the mist. He was tall, dressed in dark, severe country clothes, and held himself with an unnerving stillness. He had the look of a man who was accustomed to being alone and preferred it. She recognized him instantly from his rare visits to Marley. Gideon Severn, the master of Withercombe, the vast, cold estate that bordered the gorge. He was a widower, a recluse whose grief was the subject of much county gossip. They said his heart had been buried with his young wife 5 years ago, leaving only a cold, silent shell of a man. He owned the land on both sides of the gorge, which meant, until yesterday, he had owned the bridge. His eyes, a startlingly pale gray, were fixed on her with an unnerving intensity. They were not curious, not friendly. They were analytical, as if he were assessing her the same way she had been assessing the stonework. "Most people come here to gawp at the wreckage," he said, his tone flat.
They speak of omens and bad luck. He took a step closer, his gaze sweeping over her plain dress and the sensible, worn boots on her feet. You are the first person I have heard speak of engineering. Prudence felt a flush of color rise to her cheeks. She was trespassing on his land, and she had been caught talking to herself like a madwoman. She straightened her shoulders, calling upon the composure that was her only shield. My apologies, Mr. Severn. I did not mean to disturb you.
You haven't, he replied, dismissing her apology with a slight inclination of his head. He looked back at the ruined arch. You believe the keystone was the point of failure? It was not a casual question. It was a test. I do, she said, her voice regaining its steadiness. She pointed. You can see the shearing on the remaining voussoirs. They're cracked diagonally, which means the load wasn't being distributed correctly through the center. It was pushing them apart. The fault began right at the top. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze following the line of her pointing finger. He saw it. She knew he did. The silence stretched, filled only by the river's roar. He looked back at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than cold appraisal in his eyes. It was not pity. It was something harder and more respectful. It was recognition. Who are you? He asked, his voice a low command. She met his gaze directly. The humiliation of the previous night, the sting of her aunt's cruelty, seemed to recede in the face of this direct, unadorned question. For the first time in a very long time, someone was asking who she was, not what she was for. My name is Prudence Bellamy, she said, her voice clear and plain. A faint, ironic smile touched her lips, a ghost of a thing. I am the new owner of the bridge. Gideon Severn's expression did not change, but Prudence saw a subtle shift in the focus of his gaze. The information settled behind his pale eyes, and he processed it with that same unnerving stillness. He looked from her to the ruin and back again, and a silent understanding passed between them. He understood the nature of the gift she had been given. He did not offer condolences. He did not remark on the cruelty of it. He simply nodded, a sharp, single motion that acknowledged the fact and set it aside. I see, was all he said. He turned and walked away without another word, disappearing back into the mist as silently as he had appeared. Prudence was left with the roaring of the river and the strange, lingering feeling of having been truly seen for the first time in a decade. A week passed. Life at Bramblehurst Park returned to its suffocating routine. Prudence managed the delivery of winter stores, balanced the quarterly accounts, and listened to her Aunt Honora complain about the cost of beeswax candles. The bridge was not mentioned again. It was as if the cruel joke, having been delivered, was now forgotten by its perpetrator. But Prudence did not forget. Each evening she sketched, using her father's instruments to draw the collapsed arch from memory, calculating the stresses, redesigning the keystone. It was a theoretical exercise, a way of keeping her mind sharp, but it was also a quiet act of defiance. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, a fine black carriage pulled up the gravel drive of Bramblehurst. It was not the carriage of a neighbor paying a social call. It was the carriage of Gideon Severn, its lacquered panels gleaming, the crest of the Withercombe estate emblazoned on the door. Hannah, the cook, rushed into the morning room where Prudence was darning a tablecloth. "Miss Prudence, it's Mr. Severn, the Mr. Severn!" Honora, who had been dozing in her armchair, sat bolt upright. A visitor of such stature was a rare event. She smoothed her dress and pinched her cheeks to bring some color to them.
"Louisa, your hair! Prudence, tell Hannah to bring the good tea service, and for heaven's sake, make yourself scarce."
But when the butler, an elderly man named Corbett, showed Gideon Severn into the room, his gaze swept past Honora and Louisa and settled directly on Prudence. He gave the other two women a curt, formal bow. "Mrs. Bellamy, Miss Bellamy." Then he turned his full attention to Prudence. "I have come to speak with Miss Prudence Bellamy." Honora's mouth opened, then closed. The sheer audacity of it, the breach of all social decorum, left her momentarily speechless. One did not ignore the lady of the house to address the poor relation. "My niece is occupied with household matters," Honora managed, her voice tight with displeasure. "Perhaps I or my daughter could be of assistance." "No," Gideon said, the word simple and absolute. "My business is with the owner of the Severn Bridge." He did not raise his voice, but the quiet authority in it silenced all protest. He held Prudence's gaze. "I am asking. Answer plainly." The directness of his command cut through the cloying atmosphere of the room. It was a lifeline. Prudence placed the tablecloth and her sewing basket aside. She stood up. "Of course, Mr. Severn. Shall we speak in the library?" She led the way to the small, dusty room, acutely aware of her aunt's furious stare boring into her back. Once the door was closed, a tense silence filled the space. Gideon Severn did not sit. He stood by the window, looking out at the overgrown gardens. "The county council met yesterday," he began, without preamble. "They have officially declined to fund the rebuilding of the bridge. They cite the cost, £20,000, as prohibitive. The trade route will remain closed indefinitely." Prudence had expected as much. The council was led by men who had little interest in the prosperity of Marley. "That is unfortunate for the town," she said quietly. "It is inconvenient for me," he corrected, turning from the window to face her. "My estate requires the route for shipping timber and wool. The alternative adds a full day's journey. I intend to see the bridge rebuilt before the first snows." Prudence waited. She knew this was not a mere statement of fact. It was the prelude to a proposition. "I will fund the reconstruction myself," he continued. "Every penny. But I will not entrust it to the council's chosen contractors. I watched them build that bridge. Their work was shoddy, their materials substandard. The man who oversaw it, Fletcher Draycott, is either a fool or a crook." The name was familiar. Draycott was a prominent figure in the county, a man with a reputation for slick promises and poor results. "What you said at the gorge about the keystone," Gideon went on, his eyes narrowed slightly. "You have a practical mind. You see the essential point of things. I value that." He paused, letting his words settle in the quiet room. "I am proposing a formal arrangement. I will provide the capital. I want you to oversee the project. You will draft the new design, hire the masons, manage the procurement of materials, and supervise the work. You will report directly to me." Prudence was stunned into silence. It was an astonishing proposal. He was offering her not just a task, but a position of immense responsibility, of trust. "Me?" she finally managed to say. "I have no formal qualifications, Mr. Severn. Only what my father taught me." "Your father taught you well," he stated. "I am not interested in formal qualifications.
I am interested in competence. I saw it in you in 5 minutes at that ruin. That is more than I have seen from the county's certified engineers in 5 years. He named a figure then, a fee for her services. It was a staggering sum, more money than she had ever imagined holding in her own hands. It was enough to buy her freedom from Bramblehurst 100 times over. The funds will be deposited in an account in your name, he finished. You will have full authority over the budget. This was the heart of it. He was offering her not just a job, but independence, power, a way out. Behind her, she could almost feel the suffocating weight of her aunt's dominion. Ahead of her, a path was opening, a path paved with hard work and her own skill. It was a terrifying, exhilarating prospect. She thought of her father's brass ruler, of the integrity of a well-built structure. This was her chance to build something not just of stone, but for herself.
She lifted her chin and met his gaze, her own resolve as solid and unyielding as his. "I will do it," she said. The following Monday, the work began. Prudence left Bramblehurst at sunrise, a packed lunch of bread and cheese in her satchel, and her father's leather-bound tool roll under her arm. Her aunt Honora had been apoplectic, her fury a cold, simmering rage that was far more unnerving than any shouting. She had tried to forbid it, claiming it was unseemly, improper for a young woman to be working among laborers. But Gideon Severn's contract, delivered by a solicitor from Marley, had been irrefutable. It was a legal agreement between two parties, and Honora had no standing to interfere. The fee, paid into Prudence's own bank account, was an iron wall against her aunt's authority. For the first time, Prudence had power, and the feeling was as bracing as the crisp autumn air. The work site at the gorge was a hive of controlled chaos. A small army of men was already clearing the rubble, their shouts and the clang of their tools echoing off the rock walls. A gruff, broad-shouldered foreman with hands like shovels approached her, his expression skeptical. "You'll be Miss Bellamy, then?" he asked, his tone dubious. His name was Gill, and he had been recommended by Gideon as the best stonemason in the county. "I am," Prudence said, undaunted. She unrolled her father's tools on a makeshift table of planks and trestles. Then she unrolled her own drawings, which she had spent every night for a week perfecting. They were clean, precise, and detailed. She pointed to the cross-section of the new keystone. "This is the critical element," she said, her voice clear and steady over the noise. "The angle of the cut must be exact to 3 degrees. I want to inspect every single voussoir before it is lifted into place. The mortar mix will be 1 part lime to 2 parts sharp river sand, no exceptions. We will build cofferdams to repair the northern abutment foundation before any new stone is laid above it." Gill stared at the drawings, his skeptical expression slowly morphing into one of grudging respect. He picked up one of her detailed sheets, which specified the curing times for the mortar at different temperatures. "My father was an engineer," Prudence added quietly. "He believed in doing a thing right, or not at all." Gill grunted, a sound of approval deep in his chest. "Aye, well, he'd have hated the last lot then." He looked from the drawings to her. "We'll do it your way, miss." That was the beginning. Her authority, once established, was never questioned by the crew again. They saw her quiet competence, her tireless presence. She was the first to arrive each morning, and the last to leave, her gray dress often smudged with dust and her boots caked in mud. She missed nothing. She checked the quality of the timber delivered for the scaffolding, rejecting a load that showed signs of rot. She meticulously reviewed the supply invoices each evening, catching an error, or an attempt at fraud, from a supplier who had charged them for 20 barrels of lime, but delivered only 18. The 2-barrel discrepancy was small, but the principle was not. She sent a note with the driver demanding the rest of the order, and it was delivered the next day with a grudging apology. Gideon Severn was a constant, distant presence. He would ride out from Withercombe on his black horse, observing the progress from a high bluff on the opposite side of the gorge. He never interfered, never offered unsolicited advice. He simply watched. Prudence was aware of his gaze, a silent, steady scrutiny that was neither critical nor complimentary. It was simply observant. He was weighing her, measuring her performance against the trust he had placed in her. One afternoon, a cold rain began to fall, turning the site into a slick, muddy morass. Prudence was conferring with Gil over the new plans for the abutment, shielding the paper with her own body as the rain dripped from the brim of her bonnet. A carriage rumbled to a stop nearby. Gideon's man, a stern-faced coachman named Ned, appeared at her elbow with a heavy oilskin cloak. "Mr. Severn's compliments, miss. He says you're to use his library at the house when the weather is inclement. There's a fire lit." Prudence was about to refuse, not wanting to seem weak, but then she looked at her precious drawings, the ink beginning to feather in the damp. "Thank you," she said, accepting the cloak. "Please tell Mr. Severn I am grateful." The library at Withercombe was like stepping into another world. It was a vast, 2-story room, lined from floor to ceiling with books. But it was a silent, cold space. Dust sheets covered most of the furniture, and the air was stale, as if the room had been holding its breath for years. A small fire crackled in the enormous hearth, a lonely circle of warmth in the cavernous chamber. An elderly housekeeper with a wary, pinched face showed her to a large oak desk. "Mr. Severn said you were to have whatever you need," the woman, Hannah, said, her tone implying that this was a great and baffling inconvenience. Prudence thanked her and laid out her drawings. The library was a treasure trove. It held not just novels and poetry, but entire sections on architecture, geology, and engineering. She found a volume on Roman aqueducts that gave her a new idea for strengthening the bridge's decking. She became so absorbed in her work, cross-referencing the book with her own calculations, that she lost all track of time. She worked through the afternoon and into the evening, the only sounds the whisper of her pencil on the paper and the crackle of the fire. The house was utterly still, a sleeping giant. It was a place of profound, deep-seated grief. She could feel it in the silence, in the shrouded furniture, in the cold that even the fire could not quite dispel. Withercombe was the mirror of its master, sealed, remote, and locked in the past. But as Prudence worked, a small, almost imperceptible change began to take place. She was a point of quiet, focused life in the dormant house. Her presence was an anomaly, a disruption of the stasis. She was not grieving. She was building. Prudence's visits to the Withercombe Library became a regular occurrence, dictated by the weather or the need for a quiet space to work through complex calculations. At first, the housekeeper, Hannah, treated her with a stiff formality, bringing a tea tray at precisely 4 o'clock and removing it at precisely 4:30, whether Prudence was finished or not. The house remained cold and silent around her. But Hannah, like Gil, the foreman, was a person who respected competence. She saw the long hours Prudence worked, the intense focus she brought to her task. She saw the neat stacks of books returned to their exact places on the shelves. She saw that Prudence asked for nothing and tidied up after herself, leaving the grand desk as clear as she had found it. One day, a fierce autumn wind rattled the window panes.
Hannah entered not with the tea tray, but with a thick woolen shawl. "You'll catch your death in this draughty old place," she said, her voice gruff, and draped it over Prudence's shoulders. It was a small gesture, but it was a turning point, a signal of acceptance. From then on, the library felt a little less cold. The fire was always built up high before she arrived. The tea tray would sometimes include a plate of warm scones or a slice of seed cake. Hannah might linger for a moment, offering a comment on the weather or asking a quiet question about the bridge's progress. The town of Marley was buzzing with news of the work, and Hannah, it turned out, was a collector of local information. Through these brief, clipped conversations, Prudence began to understand the geography of Gideon's grief. Hannah had been his late wife's personal maid. She spoke of Eleanor Severn with a fierce, protective loyalty. She had been beautiful, vibrant, and fragile, like a hothouse flower. Her death in childbirth, along with the infant, had shattered the house and its master. "He locked it all away," Hannah said one afternoon, her hands twisting in her apron as she stared into the fire. "Her rooms, the nursery. He turned the key and never looked back. This house has been waiting for 5 years, miss. Just waiting." Prudence looked around the magnificent, lifeless room. She thought of the dust sheets, the closed-off wings, the profound silence. She was not just rebuilding a bridge. She was trespassing in a mausoleum. That evening, she worked later than usual, wrestling with a particularly difficult problem concerning the load distribution on the new roadbed. The fire had burned down to embers, and the library was cast in deep shadow, lit only by her single lamp. She must have drifted off, her head resting on her folded arms on the desk, the exhaustion of weeks of relentless work finally claiming her. She was woken by the subtle feeling of a change in the room's atmosphere. She lifted her head, disoriented. A heavy blanket was draped over her shoulders, warm and smelling faintly of cedar and old leather. Gideon Severn was standing by the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantel. He was watching her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Prudence's heart gave a sudden, sharp jolt. She had no idea how long he had been there. "Mr. Severn," she said, her voice thick with sleep. She started to push the blanket off. "Forgive me, I didn't mean to—" "Stay," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You were cold." He had not put a log on the fire. He had brought a blanket. The gesture was so unexpectedly personal, so much more intimate than merely tending to the hearth. He walked over to the desk and looked down at her drawings. His gaze was sharp, taking in the complex web of lines and numbers. "You have solved the decking issue," he stated, pointing a long finger at a series of calculations in the margin. It was not a question. He had understood her work at a glance. "I believe so," she said, her mind clearing rapidly. "By using a series of smaller, interlocking support arches beneath the roadbed, based on the Roman design, we can distribute the weight more evenly and reduce the lateral stress on the main arch." "It will be stronger than the original," he said. It was a statement of fact. "Yes." A long silence fell between them. It was different from their earlier silences. It was no longer the formal quiet of a business arrangement, but something more complex, more resonant. He was no longer just the distant, observing employer. He was here, in the quiet intimacy of the lamp-lit room. He looked from the drawings to her face. "You work too hard, Miss Bellamy." "The first snows will not wait for us to be well rested, Mr. Severn," she replied, her voice regaining its usual composure. A faint, almost imperceptible softening occurred at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile, but it was the closest she had ever seen.
No, he agreed. They will not. He did not move away. He stood there, a tall, dark shape beside her desk, and the space between them seemed to be charged with a quiet energy. For the first time, Prudence felt something other than professional respect or gratitude toward him. It was a sudden, sharp awareness of him as a man, not just a benefactor. An awareness of his stillness, his quiet intensity, his profound loneliness that seemed to call to the loneliness in her own heart. The moment was broken by the chiming of a distant clock. He straightened up, the spell broken. "It is late," he said. "Ned will see you home." He turned and left the library without another word, leaving her alone with the warm blanket, the dying fire, and a strange, unsettling warmth spreading through her chest. We'll take a very short break.
If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel.
The news of the bridge's rapid progress and of Prudence's constant presence at Withercombe spread through Marley and the surrounding county like wildfire. What began as grudging admiration from the townspeople, who saw the prospect of their livelihoods being restored, soon became a source of venomous gossip in the drawing rooms of the local gentry. The architect of this gossip was, unsurprisingly, Aunt Honora. Robbed of her unpaid servant and her sense of control, she saw Prudence's success not as a triumph, but as a personal affront. Her whispers found a powerful and polished ally in Arabella Devereux. Miss Devereux was the county's reigning beauty, wealthy in her own right, with a sharp wit and even sharper ambition. For 2 seasons, she had set her sights on Gideon Severn and the vast Withercombe estate. She had seen his grief as a temporary obstacle, one that a charming and determined woman could easily overcome. But Gideon had remained impervious to her charms. Now, to see him grant access and authority to a plain, penniless spinster like Prudence Bellamy was more than an inconvenience. It was an insult. The rumors began subtly. Whispers at tea parties that it was all a terrible waste of Mr. Severn's money, that the bridge was surely unsafe, being designed by an amateur. Then the gossip turned more personal. It was scandalous, they murmured, for a young, unmarried woman to be spending so much time alone with a man like Mr. Severn, especially at his isolated estate. They painted Prudence as a conniving opportunist, using feminine wiles to entrap the grieving widower. Lady Dorothea Crane, the formidable widow of the late county magistrate, heard these rumors over her card table. A woman whose tongue was as sharp as her mind, she was the undisputed arbiter of social standing in the region. Initially, she was inclined to believe them. It had the ring of a familiar, sordid story. "A girl with no prospects and a rich recluse," she'd said to a friend, her eyes glinting. "The story writes itself." The opposition, however, was not content with mere gossip. As autumn deepened and the bridge neared completion, it became clear that the new route would be open before the first snow. This would not only restore Marley's economy, but also significantly increase the value and influence of Gideon's Withercombe estate. This was a direct threat to Fletcher Draycott, the councilman who had overseen the original bridge's construction. An investigation into the collapse, which would surely follow the new bridge's opening, would expose his negligence and the kickbacks he'd received from the original shoddy contractors. His career and reputation were at stake. One evening, Draycott met with Honora Bellamy and Arabella Devereux in the back parlor of a Marley inn. The air was thick with conspiracy. "The work is nearly finished," Draycott said, his face pale with sweat despite the room's chill. "Once that bridge opens, Severn will have the council in his pocket,
He'll call for an inquiry. I'll be ruined. We need to stop the project, Honora said, her voice a venomous hiss. We need to discredit the girl. Publicly. Arabella, ever the strategist, tapped a manicured finger on the table. Her competence is her shield. The townspeople admire her. The workers are loyal to her. We cannot attack her work directly. We must attack its foundation. Her eyes gleamed with a cruel intelligence. Her father. Fletcher Draycott looked up, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. Her father? The engineer? Exactly, Arabella said. What if he wasn't the genius she makes him out to be? What if he was a fraud? A disgraced charlatan whose shoddy work has collapsed before? Honora leaned forward, her expression greedy. Can you prove it? One doesn't need to prove it, Arabella said with a dismissive wave of her hand. One simply needs to create the evidence.
Draycott, you have access to the county archives, do you not? Examples of old engineering proposals. And you, Mrs. Bellamy, you must have letters from your late brother-in-law. A sample of his handwriting is all that is required. The plot was as simple as it was vicious. They would commission a forger to create a letter, a confession, supposedly from Prudence's father. In it, he would lament his history of failed projects and shoddy methods, and confess to having taught his daughter his dishonest tricks. They would send it anonymously to the one person who could stop everything with a single word. The one person whose trust was the bedrock of the entire enterprise. Gideon Severn. They would not attack the bridge with hammers and saws. They would attack it with a single, poisoned piece of paper. The letter arrived at Withycombe on a day of triumph. The final keystone, a perfect, massive block of granite, had been lowered into place that morning. A cheer had gone up from the workers on both sides of the gorge, a raw, heartfelt sound that had echoed like a cannon shot. Prudence, standing beside Gil, had felt a surge of pride so fierce it almost brought tears to her eyes. She had done it. They had done it. That evening, Gideon had sent a note asking her to dine with him at the Manor. It was not a request to review plans or budgets. It was an invitation. A celebration. When she arrived, Hannah greeted her with a rare, genuine smile, taking her cloak and showing her not to the library, but to the small, formal dining room. The dust sheets were gone. The room was lit by a dozen candles, the table set for two, with gleaming silver and crystal. It was the first time Prudence realized that this room had been used since his wife's death. But when Gideon entered, the celebratory mood evaporated. He was holding a letter, a single sheet of cream-coloured paper. The warmth that had begun to kindle between them was gone, replaced by the familiar, remote coldness she remembered from their first meeting. His face was a mask of stone. "Good evening, Miss Bellamy," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He did not invite her to sit. He did not look at her. He looked at the letter in his hand. "I received this today." He held it out. Prudence took it, her fingers suddenly numb. The handwriting was a shockingly accurate imitation of her father's elegant, sloping script. She began to read. It was a confession, a rambling, maudlin letter addressed to a nameless old friend. It spoke of a career built on deceit, of bridges that had cracked and buildings with faulty foundations. It spoke of cutting corners, of using cheap materials. And then came the final, venomous paragraph. "I have taught my daughter Prudence all that I know. It is my final, most bitter regret, for I have armed her with my own flaws. I pray she does not follow my path. But I fear the foundations I laid in her character are as unsound as those I laid in stone." Prudence felt the blood drain from her face. It was a monstrous, impossible lie, a desecration of her father's memory. He had been a man of unimpeachable integrity, a man who had lost commissions because he refused to compromise on safety or quality. "This is a forgery," she said, her voice a strangled whisper. "A cruel and vicious lie." Gideon finally looked at her, his pale eyes as cold and hard as river ice. "Is it?" He was a man who prized evidence above all else. His entire life, his business dealings, were built on fact and proof. And in his hand, he held a piece of powerful, damning evidence. His trust in her had been an anomaly, a departure from his nature. Now, faced with this document, his old, skeptical, wounded self had reasserted control. A past betrayal. Prudence did not know its nature, but she had felt its shadow in the house, had made him permanently wary of deception. "The work on the bridge has been exemplary," he said, his voice clipped and precise, as if he were arguing with himself.
"But this," he gestured to the letter, "this suggests a history, a pattern. Perhaps you are simply more skilled at concealment than your father was." The accusation hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. Prudence felt a familiar, crushing weight. It was the same dismissal she had endured for years from her aunt, the same assumption of her worthlessness. For a moment, she wanted to crumble, to retreat into the shell of quiet endurance she knew so well. But then she thought of the bridge. She thought of the solid, honest stone. She thought of the men who had trusted her. She thought of the pride she had felt just hours before. She would not let this lie shatter it. She straightened her back and lifted her chin, her own gaze becoming as steady and unyielding as his. She would not plead. She would not cry. She would meet this crisis with the same tools she had used to build the bridge: logic, evidence, and integrity. "You have read a letter," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with a strange new authority. "Now look at me. Look at the work that has been done. Look at the ledgers in your library, which account for every nail and every penny. The evidence is there, Mr. Severn. It is in the stone of the abutments and the grain of the timber. It is real. This letter is a ghost." She took a step closer, her eyes locked on his. "If you choose to believe this forgery over the evidence of your own eyes, over the past 3 months of honest work, then you do not doubt me. You doubt yourself. And I will not work with a partner who does not trust the evidence before him." It was a gamble, a defiance born of desperation and a deep, unshakable knowledge of the truth. She had laid her own integrity on the line, forcing him to choose. For a long, agonizing moment, he was utterly still. He looked from her face, pale but resolute, to the letter in his hand. He was a man caught between two opposing pieces of evidence: the tangible reality of her character and the insidious whisper of a well-crafted lie. This was the true test, not of her, but of him. He slowly raised the letter. Prudence held her breath. He did not reread it. He carried it to the fireplace, where the candles on the mantelpiece burned brightly. He held the corner of the paper to a flame. It caught, curling into a black, brittle scroll. The acrid smell of burning paper filled the room. He dropped the flaming remnants onto the hearth, where they quickly turned to ash. He turned back to her, and the ice in his eyes had broken. In its place was a look of profound, weary regret. "The evidence of your character outweighs this," he said, his voice low and rough. "Forgive me." He took a step toward her, closing the small, fraught distance between them. "We will finish this." He paused, and the next word was spoken with a deliberate weight, a promise. Together. The public opening of the new Severn Bridge was scheduled for the last Saturday in October, a day of crisp blue skies and the last lingering warmth of autumn. The entire county was abuzz. An official ceremony was to be held in the Marley Town Hall, followed by a procession to the bridge itself for the ribbon cutting. For the town, it was a day of celebration, the long-awaited revival of their fortunes. For Prudence, it was the culmination of everything she had worked for. For Honora Bellamy, Arabella Devereux, and Fletcher Draycott, it was a declaration of war. Their plan to sow doubt in Gideon's mind had failed spectacularly. Not only had it not stopped the project, it had forged a bond between Prudence and Gideon that was now stronger and more visible than ever. Gideon had insisted Prudence sit beside him on the dais in the town hall, a place of honor that made her status as his partner explicit. They now had no choice but to escalate their attack from private slander to public execution. The town hall was packed. Every seat was filled, and people stood 3 deep along the walls.
The air was festive, charged with anticipation. Prudence, seated on the stage in a new dress of deep blue wool, a gift from Gideon delivered by Hannah with a note that simply read, "For the occasion," felt a tremor of nervous energy. Beside her, Gideon was a pillar of calm, his posture erect, his gaze sweeping over the crowd with quiet authority. The mayor made a long-winded speech. Several councilmen followed, each trying to take credit for the project they had refused to fund. Finally, Gideon rose to speak. His words were, as always, plain and direct. He thanked the workers, naming Gill and his team of masons. He spoke of the importance of the trade route to the prosperity of the entire region. Then he turned to Prudence. "This project would not have been possible," he said, his voice resonating through the silent hall, "without the skill, integrity, and tireless dedication of one person." He gestured to her. Miss Prudence Bellamy, who took a ruin and gave us back a landmark. A wave of sincere, heartfelt applause swept through the hall. Prudence felt a blush rise to her cheeks, a warmth that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with pride. It was in that moment of her highest triumph that the attack came. "A point of order, Mr. Mayor." The voice was sharp and self-important. Fletcher Draycott pushed his way to the front of the hall, his face flushed with a combination of drink and manufactured outrage. "I cannot, in good conscience, allow this celebration to proceed under false pretenses." A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. Gideon's hand, resting on the table, clenched into a fist, but he gave no other sign of reaction. Prudence felt a cold dread snake through her. She had known they would try something. She had not expected it to be so brazen. "The good people of this county believe this bridge was built on a foundation of honest stone," Draycott announced, his voice ringing with theatrical sincerity. "But I have reason to believe it was built on a foundation of lies. A legacy of fraud passed down from father to daughter." Beside him, Arabella Devereux rose, a vision of sorrowful beauty. "It is with the heaviest heart that I must support Mr. Draycott," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Certain information has come to my attention concerning the late Mr. Bellamy's professional history. It pains me to say it, but it seems he was a disgraced engineer."
In the third row, Honora Bellamy dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, a perfect performance of a loyal sister-in-law forced to confront a terrible truth. The trap was sprung. The accusations were public, venomous, and perfectly staged. They had not merely accused Prudence of fraud. They had desecrated her father's name in front of the entire county. The festive atmosphere in the hall curdled into one of shocked, prurient curiosity. All eyes were on Prudence, waiting for her to crumble. They wanted to see her deny, weep, protest. They wanted a spectacle. Prudence did none of those things. She felt Gideon's gaze on her, a silent question. She gave him the slightest of nods. They had prepared for this. They had hoped it would not be necessary, but they were ready. She stood up, her movements calm and deliberate. She did not look at Draycott or Arabella. She looked out at the faces in the crowd, the masons, the shopkeepers from Marley, her cousin Louisa, who looked pale and horrified. "Mr. Draycott is correct about one thing," Prudence said, her voice quiet, but carrying to every corner of the silent hall. "A bridge's integrity does indeed depend upon its foundation." Her gaze then settled on Fletcher Draycott, and her eyes were as cold and hard as granite. "And so does a man's reputation." Gideon made a quiet signal to a man standing near the back door. A moment later, the door opened, and a figure swept into the hall, commanding immediate attention. It was Lady Dorothea Crane. Lady Dorothea Crane moved through the stunned crowd with the authority of a ship of the line sailing into a harbor of fishing skiffs. She was dressed in severe black silk, a heavy gold locket at her throat, and her expression was one of profound, icy displeasure. She had been, as Gideon had predicted, outraged by the anonymous rumors. But unlike others, she had not been content to merely gossip. Her late husband, the magistrate, had taught her to value evidence over hearsay. She had made her own quiet inquiries. She had spoken to the merchants in Marley. She had visited the worksite herself, observing Prudence's quiet command. She had contrasted it with Honora's spite and Arabella's ambition. Lady Crane had converted from a skeptic to a champion. She stopped before the dais, her sharp gaze pinning Fletcher Draycott like an insect to a board. "Mr. Draycott," she began, her voice like the crack of a whip, "you speak of fraud. An interesting choice of words from a man who signed the inspection certificate for the original Severn Bridge not 2 years ago. A bridge built with inferior mortar and timber by a contractor who, my sources tell me, paid you a handsome consulting fee of £500 for the privilege." A collective gasp went through the hall. Draycott turned a pasty white. "That is a slanderous accusation." "Is it?" Lady Crane retorted. "I have a sworn statement from the contractor's former clerk, who is prepared to testify before a magistrate. Shall I read it?" She produced a document from her reticule. Draycott stared at it, his blustering confidence collapsing in an instant. Lady Crane then turned her formidable attention to the crowd. "I have also reviewed Miss Bellamy's ledgers for this project," she announced. "They are models of fiscal prudence and transparency. The only fraud here is the one being perpetrated by those whose corruption and negligence this new bridge has threatened to expose. The tide of public opinion, so recently turned against Prudence, swung back with the force of a tidal wave. The murmurs were now directed at Draycott, at Arabella, whose mask of sorrow was beginning to look like panicked fury, and at Honora, who seemed to be shrinking in her seat. But the vindication was not complete. Gideon gave Prudence another encouraging nod. This final piece was hers to deliver. Prudence stepped forward. She was no longer just a defendant,
She was a prosecutor. In her hand, she held the worn, brass, parallel ruler that had belonged to her father. "Mr. Draycott accuses my father of being a disgrace," she said, her voice clear and strong. "It is true that my father had a professional rival, a man notorious for using substandard materials and bribing inspectors to approve unsafe structures. A man he exposed at great cost to his own career. That man's name was Alistair Draycott." She paused, letting the name land. Fletcher Draycott's father. The shock in the hall was palpable. This was not just about a bridge. It was a generational feud, a bitter, long-simmering revenge. "They have tried to discredit my father with forgeries and lies," Prudence continued, her voice ringing with the power of absolute truth. "So I have brought a letter of my own." She reached into her reticule and produced a folded, yellowed document. It was not a forgery. It was real. "This is a letter to my father from the Royal Society of Engineers, dated 15 years ago." She unfolded it. "It commends him for his courage and integrity in exposing the elder Mr. Draycott's fraudulent use of unseasoned timber in the construction of the King's Bridge at Penrose. It thanks him for preventing a catastrophe not unlike the one that befell our own bridge." She held the letter aloft. The official seal of the society was clearly visible. "This is my father's legacy," she declared, her voice trembling now, not with fear, but with a righteous, long-suppressed anger. "It is a legacy of honor, of competence, and of integrity. I have done my best to live up to it." She lowered her hand and looked directly at Honora. "Some people build things," she said, her voice dropping to a quiet, devastating finality. "Others only know how to tear them down." It was over. The rout was absolute. Fletcher Draycott, utterly exposed, stumbled out of the hall to a chorus of jeers. Arabella Devereux, her face a mask of humiliation, followed, her social standing in the county shattered in a single afternoon. Honora Bellamy simply sat, frozen, as the community she had tried to manipulate turned its back on her. Prudence stood on the dais, her father's ruler in one hand, his vindication in the other, the roar of the crowd's approval washing over her like a cleansing rain. The rest of the day passed in a blur for Prudence. The procession to the bridge, the cheering crowds, the satisfying snip of the scissors as she and Gideon cut the ceremonial ribbon together. The first wagons, laden with wool and grain, rumbled across the new, solid roadbed, their passage a testament to her work. But through it all, she was waiting for the noise to fade, for the crowds to disperse, waiting for the quiet that she knew must follow. As dusk settled, casting long purple shadows into the gorge, she found herself alone on the bridge. The air was cold and sharp, carrying the promise of the coming winter. The first tentative snowflakes began to drift down, melting as they touched the dark, damp stone. She ran her hand over the top of the parapet. The granite was smooth, solid, and real under her palm. She had built this. Out of a ruin, she had made something whole and strong. She heard footsteps behind her and knew, without turning, that it was him. Gideon came to stand beside her, the space between them no longer fraught with uncertainty, but filled with a comfortable, shared silence. They watched the snowflakes swirl in the twilight. "They gave you a ruin," he said at last, his voice a low, deep murmur against the whisper of the wind. "And you have built a foundation. For this town. For Withercombe." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was rough with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "For me." Prudence turned to look at him. In the fading light, his face was stripped of its harsh, remote mask. She saw in his eyes the grief he had carried for so long. But she also saw something new, a fragile, dawning hope. He took her hand, his grasp warm and firm around her cold fingers. Then, to her utter astonishment, he went down on one knee on the hard, frozen ground of the bridge she had built. "My life was a ruin too, Prudence," he said, his gaze fixed on hers. "Cold and empty, locked away behind walls of my own making. I am asking you to be its architect. I am asking you to build a life with me." He was not a prince rescuing a damsel. He was a man acknowledging his own brokenness and seeing in her the strength to rebuild. "Not because I need to rescue you," he continued, as if reading her mind, "but because you have rescued me. You have shown me what integrity looks like, what it feels like. I love you, Prudence Bellamy. Will you marry me?" The wind picked up, whipping a strand of hair across her face. The snow was falling faster now, dusting his dark hair and broad shoulders with white. She looked at this man, this quiet, difficult, honorable man who had seen her, truly seen her, when she had been invisible to everyone else. He had given her a chance, and she had taken it. Now he was giving her his heart. Her answer was as plain and solid as the stone beneath their feet. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and sure in the winter air. "Yes, Gideon. Together." 1 year later, autumn had returned to Withercombe, but it was a different season now. It was not a time of closing down, of preparing for a long, cold darkness. It was a season of harvest, of warmth, of vibrant, living color. The great house was no longer a silent, grieving mausoleum. Its windows were unshuttered, blazing with light against the evening chill. The scent of beeswax and baking bread had replaced the stale smell of dust and disuse. Laughter, a sound unheard for 5 years, now echoed in the long corridors. Withercombe was alive again. The transformation had begun with the gardens. Prudence, who had spent her childhood tending her father's small but meticulous vegetable patch, could not bear to see the once famous Withercombe gardens choked with weeds and neglect. With the same quiet determination she had brought to the bridge, she had hired gardeners, planned new beds, and spent hours with her own hands in the soil. As the roses and delphiniums had bloomed, so had the house. Hannah, her gruff exterior melted away to reveal a deep well of loyalty and affection, now presided over a bustling household, humming as she worked. The dust sheets were a distant memory, and the rooms that had been locked away for 5 years were now aired, cleaned, and lived in. The nursery at the top of the house was no longer a sealed tomb of grief. It was being repainted in a cheerful shade of yellow in preparation for the spring. Prudence was no mere lady of the manor. She was Gideon's partner in every sense of the word. Her desk was now a permanent fixture in the Withercombe library, placed beside his. Her sharp mind and meticulous attention to detail, once spent on stretching her aunt's meager budget, were now applied to the management of a vast and thriving estate. Tenants and local business owners soon learned that Mrs. Severn was not only fair and compassionate, but that she possessed an unnervingly precise memory for contracts and accounts. She was respected, not just for her title, but for her competence. This evening, she was not looking at estate ledgers. Spread across her desk were architectural drawings for a new building. Gideon came into the library and placed a hand on her shoulder, looking down at her work. "A school?" he asked.
"For Marley," she confirmed, pointing with the tip of her pencil. "If we use local timber and the stone from the quarry at Sorrel Down, I believe we can build it for half of what the council quoted." He smiled, a genuine, easy expression that was now as familiar to her as his own name. "I have no doubt you can." On the grand marble mantelpiece, where a collection of porcelain figurines had once stood, a single object now rested in the place of honor: her father's heavy brass parallel ruler. It gleamed in the firelight, no longer a hidden, secret symbol of endurance, but a public mark of her journey. It was a reminder of where she had come from, and a testament to the life she had built. News from the rest of the county came infrequently. Fletcher Draycott had been forced to resign from the council in disgrace and had moved away. Arabella Devereux had made an advantageous but reportedly unhappy marriage to an aging lord in the north. Aunt Honora still lived in Marley, but in a small, damp cottage by the river. Her social standing evaporated, her invitations to tea parties long since dried up. She was a bitter, lonely woman, a ruin of her own making. Her daughter, Louisa, the redeemable cousin, had surprised everyone. Freed from her mother's domineering influence, she had taken a position as a governess and wrote to Prudence occasionally. The letters were tentative, filled with a clumsy, sincere apology for her years of passive complicity. Prudence always wrote back, her replies kind but clear-eyed, offering forgiveness without illusion. Prudence and Gideon stood together at the library window, looking out into the twilight. In the distance, they could see the elegant, powerful arch of the Severn Bridge. A long line of merchant carts was crossing it, their lanterns tiny points of golden light, rushing to make their deliveries before the winter snows truly set in. The bridge stood firm, a lifeline carved in stone, connecting the past to the future.
It was a symbol of their county's renewed prosperity, but for Prudence and Gideon, it was something more. It was a monument to integrity, a foundation for their life, a testament to the simple, powerful truth that even the most broken things could be rebuilt, stronger and more beautiful than before. Together. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.